I grew up in a small town in Maine, the kind of place where you knew all your neighbors and everyone seemed to live the same quiet life. Our town's one playground, set on the outskirts, had long since been abandoned. The metal equipment was rusting and the grass was overgrown, but as kids, we didn't care. We still played there every weekend. Now, years later, I found myself back in town, driven by nostalgia and, if I'm honest, some personal failure. I had nowhere else to go. I left the city after a failed marriage, a job that ate away at me, and a string of disappointments I couldn't bear to relive. So, I returned home. I hadn't visited the old playground since I was a kid, but something called me back. It was early autumn, the air crisp and the leaves starting to turn, that perfect blend of chilly and comfortable. I decided to take a walk, aimlessly at first, but eventually my feet led me down the familiar road toward the park. As I approached, I felt a strange tension creep over me, the playground coming into view like some decaying monument of my childhood. The rusty swing set stood stark against the orange sky, its chains clinking softly in the wind. The air seemed to thicken as I stepped through the broken gate, making my breath feel heavier. The sound of the swings creaking filled the silence, but it was the doll that caught my eye first. It sat on one of the swings, its faded face staring blankly forward. It was one of those old porcelain dolls, the kind you'd find at an antique store or in your grandmother's attic. One of its eyes was cracked, and its hair was matted, but it was unmistakably out of place. Who would leave a doll here? I don't know why, but I stepped closer. Something about the way it sat, its head slightly tilted, made me uneasy. My chest tightened, my pulse quickened, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. It's just a forgotten toy, left behind by some kid who probably doesn't even remember bringing it. Yet, the longer I stared at it, the more I felt like it was waiting. Waiting for what? I forced myself to break away from the sight, continuing my slow walk around the park. The sandbox was overgrown with weeds, the slides covered in rust, and yet there was something else. More toys. A teddy bear, dirt-stained and missing an ear, lay near the seesaw. A plastic truck, so old its colors had faded, was half buried in the grass. A pair of tiny shoes, perfectly placed side by side, sat near the jungle gym. Goosebumps prickled across my arms as I looked around, feeling like I was intruding on something I didn't understand. What disturbed me wasn't the toys themselves, but how they seemed deliberately placed. It wasn't the chaotic scatter of things left behind. They were arranged, positioned. My breath caught in my throat as I turned back toward the swing set. The doll was still there, staring, its broken eye now pointed right at me. I hadn't noticed it at first, but there was something else, a shadow, long and thin, stretching from the swing set out toward me, though the sun was low, and it shouldn't have cast that kind of shadow. My heart began to pound, and a cold sweat formed on my brow. I felt a sudden need to leave, to walk away before something worse happened, but my legs were frozen, my eyes locked on that strange shadow and the doll. Then I heard it, a faint laugh, high-pitched and childlike, coming from behind me. My skin crawled, and I turned sharply, scanning the park, but there was no one. Just the wind rustling through the trees and the old, decaying equipment. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the growing fear tightening in my chest. "Get a grip, man," I muttered, but the words felt hollow. I needed to go. Something was wrong here. As I turned to leave, my gaze caught on the ground near the swings, and my blood ran cold. Small footprints, leading away from the doll, imprinted in the dirt, like a child had walked away, but there was no one around. I didn't wait to think. I bolted from the playground, heart racing, and didn't stop until I reached the safety of my childhood home. The last thing I saw before I fled was the doll, swaying gently in the breeze, watching me leave. Underscore That night, I lay in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every sound in the house seemed louder, every creak of the floorboards like a footstep. I tried to convince myself that it was just a creepy coincidence, just old toys left behind by long-forgotten children. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling. Who left them there? And why? The next morning, I decided I wouldn't go back. Whatever curiosity I had about the old playground was gone, replaced by a creeping dread I couldn't explain. Yet, as I sat down for breakfast, something in the backyard caught my eye. It was the doll, sitting just outside my window, perfectly positioned, its cracked eye staring directly into my kitchen. I froze, the spoon halfway to my mouth, as I stared at the doll outside my window. It was impossible. There was no way it could be there. I had left the park, ran from it, actually, and yet here it was, sitting just outside my kitchen window, its cracked porcelain face still tilted in that unsettling way. My pulse quickened, my breath shallow and ragged. I tried to convince myself it was a prank. Maybe some kid had seen me at the park and followed me home, deciding to mess with me. That had to be it, but deep down I knew no one had been there. The playground was empty. The streets had been empty. Still, the logical side of me fought to regain control. I threw down my spoon, stood up, and marched outside. The morning was still cold, the grass wet with dew, and a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. The doll sat there, exactly as I had seen it, its chipped hand resting delicately on the ground, as if someone had gently placed it there. I leaned down, hesitated, and then picked it up, the cold porcelain sending a shiver through me. My fingers trembled as I turned the doll over, searching for any sign of how it had gotten here. There was nothing unusual about it, just a creepy, broken old toy. But something about it felt wrong. Its weight, its presence, like it was more than just a forgotten object. "Who put you here?" I muttered to no one in particular. My voice sounded small and weak. With a deep breath, I carried the doll around to the trash bins by the side of the house. I didn't want to keep it, didn't even want to see it again. I opened the lid of the bin, tossed the doll inside, and slammed the lid shut with finality. For a brief moment, I felt like I could breathe again. That feeling didn't last. As I turned to go back inside, a soft giggle, the same eerie laugh I'd heard at the park, drifted through the air. I whipped around, scanning the yard. There was no one, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze. My heart pounded in my ears, and I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. For the rest of the day, I tried to go about my business as usual, but I couldn't shake the nagging sensation that something was watching me. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, made me jump. I felt like I was being stalked by something unseen, something patient. By evening, the tension in my chest had built to a breaking point. I sat on the couch, my eyes glued to the television, though I couldn't focus on the program. My hands were cold and clammy, and every now and then, I found myself glancing out the window, half expecting to see that cracked porcelain face staring back at me. Then it happened again. A faint thud came from outside. My stomach twisted as I slowly stood up, inching toward the window. I didn't want to look, but I had to. The yard was dark, the faint glow of the street lamp barely cutting through the shadows. And there was the trash bin. The lid was open. "No," I whispered, stepping back, refusing to believe what I was seeing. I had closed it. I knew I had. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe an animal knocked it over. Anything but what I knew in the pit of my stomach. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out the back door, my breath fogging in the cold night air. My fingers shook as I shone the beam toward the trash bins, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the bin, I hesitated, my heart hammering in my chest. Then slowly I lifted the lid. The doll was gone. A wave of cold fear washed over me. I stood there, staring into the empty bin, the flashlight trembling in my hand. This wasn't possible. I had thrown it in there myself. I had seen it with my own eyes. And now it was gone. I turned, scanning the yard, and that's when I saw it. The doll, sitting in the middle of the yard, exactly where I had first found it, staring at me with that cracked, soulless eye. My mouth went dry, and for a moment, I couldn't move. It was like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. Then the giggle came again, louder this time, closer. My skin crawled as I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark, but there was no one. Just that laugh hanging in the air like a cruel joke. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the doll. I had to get inside, had to lock the door, and my foot caught on something, and I stumbled, the flashlight slipping from my grip. It rolled across the ground, casting wild shadows as I scrambled to grab it. When I finally did, I swung the beam back toward the yard. The doll was gone. I stared at the empty space where it had been, my mind reeling. I was losing it. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew I had to leave. I couldn't stay here any longer. Without another thought, I turned and ran back inside, slamming the door and locking every bolt, every latch. I was breathing hard, my heart racing, panic tightening in my chest. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. And then as I stood there trying to calm my racing thoughts, I heard a soft, rhythmic creaking coming from outside the window. The swing set. The swing was moving. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see. But my body moved on its own, my legs carrying me to the window, my hand pulling back the curtain just enough to see. There it was, swaying gently back and forth, the doll sitting perfectly in the seat, its face turned toward me. And as I stood there, frozen in place, the giggle came again, this time from right behind me. I froze, gripping the curtain tightly in my hand, unable to turn around. The giggle had come from right behind me, so close that I could almost feel breath on my neck. My heart pounded against my ribs, each beat louder than the last. But when I finally forced myself to turn, there was nothing. The room was empty, silent. My breaths came in ragged gasps, scanning every corner, half expecting something to leap out at me. But there was no one. No ghost, no intruder. Just me and the growing sense of dread gnawing at the edges of my mind. I needed to get a grip. Someone was doing this to me. Someone real. Someone who had been watching. Grabbing a flashlight and jacket, I stormed outside, determined to end this. There had to be clues, something left behind. I started at the swing set where I first found the doll. The grass was flattened in places, and when I knelt down, I saw them. Small footprints in the dirt. Not a child's, though. Too deliberate. The pattern was odd, almost staged. Alongside the footprints were faint, dragging marks, like something had been hauled across the ground. The trail led toward the woods, and against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I followed it. My breath grew shallow as I moved deeper into the trees. The path grew narrower, the air colder. My flashlight flickered. Then, just ahead, barely visible through the trees, a shed. Old and hidden beneath overgrowth, its door slightly ajar. I hadn't known it was there, but I felt a sickening sense of familiarity. The dragging marks ended at its door. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the smell of decay clinging to every surface. My flashlight flickered over rows of old toys lining the back wall. Dolls, stuffed animals, toy cars. All worn, forgotten. And there, in the center, was the doll, its cracked face staring at me from a wooden crate. My throat tightened as I stepped closer. Someone had set this up. But who? And why? That's when I noticed it, a small, rusted key beneath the crate, attached to a thin chain. I reached for it, and as I did, a piece of paper fluttered to the floor. My hands shook as I unfolded it, the words scrawled in messy handwriting. Do you remember now? A chill ran down my spine. What did that mean? I didn't remember any of this, the toys, the shed. None of it. But something tugged at my memory, something buried deep. I lifted the crate's lid, revealing a stack of old photographs. My heart skipped a beat. They were the playground. From years ago. There I was as a kid, playing near the swings, smiling and carefree. But in every picture, a shadowy figure stood in the background. Always there, always watching. I dropped the photos, my hands shaking uncontrollably now. This wasn't random. Someone had been following me for years, leaving these toys, leaving clues for what? Before I could think further, a twig snapped outside. My heart leapt, and I spun toward the door, flashlight trembling in my grip. The woods were silent now, too silent. But I could feel it, eyes watching me from the darkness. And then, from the trees, that same eerie giggle floated through the air. I was never the kind of guy to be nostalgic, but after my father passed away, I found myself clearing out his old house, sorting through decades of accumulated memories. My father wasn't much for sentiment, so I wasn't expecting to find much beyond the usual junk: old tools, dusty furniture, and forgotten photo albums. But among the clutter in the garage, something caught my eye: a small, red toy car, its paint chipped and its wheels worn down. I remembered that car. It was mine when I was a kid. I used to play with it every day, running it across the kitchen floor, racing it down the hallway, crashing it into the walls. A strange sense of unease stirred in my chest as I picked it up. I hadn't seen it in years, but it looked exactly the same, worn but intact, as if waiting for me. I stood there, turning it over in my hands, memories flooding back. My dad had given it to me on my 5th birthday. I had loved that car, but I could have sworn I lost it years ago, maybe when we moved houses. Yet here it was, in the old garage, where it shouldn't have been. That night, I couldn't get the car out of my mind. It sat on the dresser in the guest room where I was staying, its chipped paint glinting faintly in the low light. I stared at it for far too long, trying to shake the unsettling feeling gnawing at me. It was just a toy, an old, forgotten piece of my childhood. So, why did it feel so wrong? The next morning, I made a decision. I needed to get out of the house. Between clearing out my dad's things and dealing with the memories, it was starting to mess with my head. I went into town to grab a coffee, hoping the fresh air would clear the fog that seemed to cling to me. When I got back to the house later that afternoon, the toy car was gone. My heart skipped a beat as I stood in the doorway, staring at the empty spot on the dresser. I hadn't moved it. I hadn't touched it, but it wasn't there. Maybe I knocked it over in my sleep, or maybe I had absent-mindedly put it somewhere else. That had to be it. I spent the next hour searching the room, then the hallway, then the garage, but it was nowhere to be found. My mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe I'd thrown it out. Maybe it had fallen behind something, but nothing made sense. That creeping sense of unease began to claw at me again. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard something. A soft, barely noticeable sound. A scraping like plastic being dragged across wood. I froze, my pulse quickening, and followed the noise. It was coming from the hallway. The hallway floor was wooden, polished but old, and as I stepped closer, the sound grew louder. When I turned the corner, my blood ran cold. There in the middle of the floor was the toy car sitting perfectly still, as if waiting for me. But that wasn't what terrified me. The car had left a trail, a long, thin line etched into the wood as if it had been dragged. And the line led directly to the guest room where I had left it. I stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at the thin, jagged line scratched into the wood. The air around me felt heavy, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but the rational explanation slipped through my fingers like sand. There was no way the car had moved on its own, and yet, I stepped toward the toy car, every movement feeling slow, deliberate. The hallway seemed to stretch out in front of me, the space narrowing, walls pressing in, as if they were closing around me. My chest tightened with every step, the silence so thick I could almost feel it pushing against my skin. The only sound was my breathing, shallow, uneven. I knelt down next to the car, my fingers hovering above it. I didn't want to touch it, didn't want to feel the cold plastic under my skin. Sweat formed on the back of my neck, the sensation of being watched growing stronger, almost unbearable. But there was no one here. It was just me and this stupid, old toy. Slowly, I reached out and picked up the car. It was lighter than I remembered, almost hollow. As I turned it over in my hands, I noticed something strange, dirt caked into the wheels and grooves of the car, as if it had been outside, dragged through mud and grass. But I hadn't taken it outside. It had been in the garage when I found it, untouched for years. I stood up, the weight of the house pressing down on me, making the air feel thick and oppressive. My thoughts were spinning, irrational ideas flickering at the edge of my mind. Maybe someone had been in the house while I was gone. Maybe they were messing with me. But who? And why? I needed to get out. The walls felt too close, the air too thin. I moved quickly, shoving the car into my pocket as I headed for the front door. But as my hand reached the doorknob, I froze. There on the other side of the glass, something caught my eye. It was another toy car, just like the one in my pocket, sitting at the edge of the driveway. My breath hitched in my throat, and for a moment, I didn't move. My hand gripped the doorknob so tightly that my knuckles turned white, the cold metal biting into my skin. I stared at the car outside, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. It was the same model, the same chipped red paint. Identical. How was that possible? I swung the door open, stepping out onto the porch. The air outside felt different, thick, almost suffocating, as if it carried some unseen weight. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the sky was cast in a dull, fading gray. My pulse quickened as I approached the car, and with each step, the silence around me grew heavier. There were no birds, no breeze, no distant hum of life, just silence, wrapping itself around me like a cold blanket. I crouched down, reaching for the car, but something stopped me, a feeling, no, more than a feeling, a certainty, cold and sharp, like ice in my chest. I wasn't alone. Someone or something was watching me. I shot up, eyes darting around the yard, scanning the tree line, the driveway, the road. There was nothing, no movement, no sound, but the pressure remained, like invisible eyes boring into me. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I backed away from the car, the overwhelming sense of being trapped building inside me. I turned and hurried back inside, slamming the door behind me. The walls seemed closer now, pressing in from all sides, the house closing around me like a fist. Every creak of the floor, every groan of the old pipes made my heart race. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the house itself was choking me, holding me hostage. I had to know. I had to understand what was happening. Something wasn't right. The weight of the air pressed harder, and I stumbled back into the hallway, my mind spinning with fear and confusion. That's when I noticed the attic door. It was slightly ajar, the wooden ladder creaking softly as it swayed ever so slightly. I stared at it, my heart pounding, my chest tight, dread curling in my stomach. I hadn't opened the attic, but someone had. The silence pressed against my ears, the air so thick now that I could barely think, barely move. I stood there, staring up at the dark opening, knowing I had no choice but to climb. My feet moved on their own, each step slow, deliberate. My hand gripped the ladder as I pulled myself up, my breath shaky, uneven. As I poked my head into the attic, the stale air hit me like a wall, thick with dust and old wood. The beam of my flashlight swept across the small space, illuminating boxes and old furniture, but nothing else. For a moment, I almost allowed myself to relax. Then I saw it, a small pile of dirt, carefully placed in the center of the floor, and sitting on top of it, perfectly positioned, was the red toy car. I stared at the toy car in the attic, perched on that strange pile of dirt. My breath came in shallow gasps, the weight of the air pressing down harder than ever. The small space felt like it was closing in on me. I could feel the walls of the attic practically pushing against my back, but I couldn't look away from that toy car. What was going on? How had it gotten up here? I stepped forward slowly, the floor creaking beneath my weight, and crouched down next to the pile of dirt. My fingers hovered over the car. The dirt looked fresh, the small clumps still damp, like someone had dug it up and brought it here recently. My mind raced through possibilities, trying to grasp at any explanation that made sense. Was someone in the house? Was I losing my mind? With trembling hands, I reached out and picked up the toy car, half expecting something terrible to happen, for the walls to close in, for the shadows to leap at me. But nothing did. The attic remained eerily still, the silence thick but unbroken. I turned the car over in my hands. It was the same old, chipped red car I had found in the garage. The same one from my childhood. There was nothing particularly strange about it. No hidden compartments, no messages, no signs of tampering. Just a worn-out toy. I stood up, clutching the car tightly, and felt a wave of exhaustion hit me. The fear that had gripped me for the past 2 days, the tension of this whole situation, was wearing me down. I didn't know why it was happening, but I couldn't keep running in circles around it. I had to take control. I pocketed the car and stepped back toward the attic opening. The pressure in the air began to ease, like the house was finally letting me go. I climbed down the ladder and shut the attic door behind me, sealing it off. Back downstairs, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the car on the wooden surface. My head throbbed with questions, but there were no answers. No sinister force waiting in the shadows. Just me and an old toy, taunting me with the memories it held. And then suddenly it clicked. The dirt, the scratches on the hallway floor, the misplaced toy. I stood up, heading outside, my heart pounding with realization. I hadn't considered it before, but as I walked to the far side of the yard, the pieces began to fit together. There, next to the shed, half hidden beneath some tall grass, I saw it, a small, freshly dug patch of earth. The shovel leaned up against the shed wall, dirt still caked on the metal blade. My dad had been gardening here just before he passed. He'd always kept a small patch of flowers, a little piece of nature he cared for even when his health declined. The toy car must have been buried out here, dug up during one of my dad's gardening sessions. It had probably been left there, forgotten among the soil, until the wind or a stray animal dragged it toward the house. It was so simple, so normal. My father had kept the toy car, maybe out of sentiment, maybe it got mixed up with his things, but he hadn't forgotten it, just like I hadn't. And somehow, in all my panic and grief, I had let myself spin a strange, twisted story around something so mundane. I smiled, a little embarrassed at myself. I walked back to the shed, found a small box among my dad's old tools, and placed the toy car inside. The tightness in my chest finally eased, the pressure of the last few days lifting. It was over. There was no mystery, no malevolent force, just a forgotten toy and a mind burdened by too much grief. I carried the box inside and tucked it away in a drawer. I wasn't ready to throw it out. Not yet. Maybe someday, but for now it felt right to keep it. A small piece of my past, a memory of my dad. As I sat down on the porch, the evening air cool and calming, a sense of peace washed over me. The house was quiet now, no strange noises, no pressing weight. Just the sound of the wind in the trees and the distant hum of life outside. I let out a long breath, finally feeling like I could relax. I smiled to myself. It had all been so simple after all. That night, the silence in the house felt oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in on me. Every creak and groan of the old structure felt amplified, the weight of it pressing down on my chest. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. The grief, the exhaustion, the memories of my brother, they were playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, the shuffling. It was louder this time, unmistakable. Fabric brushing against wood, slow and deliberate, like something dragging itself across the hallway. My heart began to pound in my ears, my body frozen in place. I strained to hear more, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Then it stopped just outside my bedroom door. I sat up slowly, the room spinning around me. My mind screamed at me to stay put, to not open the door. But the silence was unbearable, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I had to see. I had to know what was happening. My feet hit the cold floor, and I crept toward the door, every step heavier than the last. My hands trembled as I reached for the doorknob, the metal cold and unforgiving beneath my palm. I turned it slowly, so slowly, the faintest creak as I pulled the door open a crack. There, in the dim light of the hallway, the teddy bear sat upright, perfectly still, facing my door. Its button eyes glinted faintly, locked onto me. I hadn't moved it. I hadn't touched it since earlier in the day. A wave of nausea hit me as I stared at the bear. I couldn't explain it, couldn't make sense of how it had gotten here. I knelt down, picking it up once more, my hands cold and shaky. The bear felt even heavier now, like its weight was increasing the longer I held it, like it was pulling something from me. I forced myself to carry it back down the hallway to Ethan's room, each step echoing in the suffocating quiet. I set the bear back on the desk, its head slightly tilted to the side, almost as if it was watching me, judging me. The air in the room felt thick, like a presence had settled in, and I couldn't stay in there any longer. I backed out of the room, my heart racing, and closed the door behind me. Back in my room, I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Every sound of the house became sinister, every shadow more oppressive. The house felt alive, aware of me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the bear was at the center of it. Watching, waiting. Sometime around 3 a.m., I finally dozed off, but my sleep was restless, full of fragmented, half-remembered dreams. I dreamed of Ethan and me as kids, playing in the yard, but the dream shifted, the sky darkening, the grass turning brittle and gray. Ethan was laughing, but it was wrong, hollow, almost mocking. I turned to look at him, but it wasn't Ethan anymore. It was the teddy bear, sitting where Ethan should have been, staring at me with those cold, empty eyes. I jolted awake, gasping for air, my heart racing in my chest. The room was still too still, but something was off. My breath hitched as I slowly scanned the room, and that's when I saw it. The teddy bear was sitting at the foot of my bed. A cold sweat broke out across my skin, and my stomach turned. I hadn't brought it here. I hadn't touched it, but there it was closer now, sitting perfectly still, its button eyes staring straight at me. I scrambled out of bed, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and grabbed the bear. It felt heavier than ever, like I was holding a bag of bricks. My hands shook violently as I carried it down the hallway, back to Ethan's room. The hallway stretched out before me, the walls seeming to close in as I moved. The house felt alive, as if it was watching my every move, waiting for me to make a mistake. I shoved the bear into the closet in Ethan's room, slamming the door shut, my chest heaving with panic. I didn't care if it was irrational, didn't care if it made no sense. That bear was wrong, and I needed it out of sight. As I turned to leave, something stopped me cold. On Ethan's desk, where the bear had been, was a photograph. A single, old photograph I hadn't seen before. I stepped closer, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. It was a picture of Ethan and me, no older than 6 or 7, sitting on the front porch of our childhood home. We were smiling, carefree. But in the corner of the photograph, half obscured by shadow, the teddy bear sat between us. I dropped the photograph, stumbling back, my breath catching in my throat. That bear had been with us for years. I didn't remember it, but there it was, plain as day in the photo. And the worst part? In the picture, Ethan's hand was gripping the bear tightly, his smile frozen in place. But his eyes looked terrified. I backed out of the room, my pulse racing, my thoughts spiraling. I had to leave. I couldn't stay in this house any longer. But as I turned to head downstairs, I heard something. A faint, soft sound. A thump. It was coming from Ethan's room. The closet door was open again, and the bear was sitting at the edge of the bed, waiting. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. The closet door, which I had slammed shut just moments ago, was wide open again. And there, at the edge of Ethan's bed, sat the teddy bear, its worn face tilted slightly upward, its black button eyes fixed on me as if it had been waiting the entire time. The air in the room felt heavier, denser. It pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe, to think. I couldn't explain it, but the longer I stared at that bear, the more it felt alive, like something inside it was watching me, playing with me. The walls seemed to close in, and I had the distinct, terrifying feeling that I wasn't alone. I took a shaky step backward, my entire body trembling. I needed to leave now. Whatever was happening, I couldn't stay here any longer. I turned, heading toward the stairs, my feet moving faster with every step, my heart racing in my ears. The hallway felt too long, too narrow, like the house itself was trying to keep me inside. Just as I reached the top of the stairs, a soft, muffled thump echoed from Ethan's room behind me. I stopped, my pulse spiking. Slowly, I turned, dreading what I might see. The bear was in the hallway now. It was sitting just outside Ethan's door, perfectly still but somehow closer. Its presence was suffocating, like it was dragging the weight of the house with it, pulling everything into its orbit. I stared at it, cold sweat dripping down the back of my neck. I hadn't moved it. No one else was here, but the bear was getting closer. Watching, I forced myself to keep moving, rushing down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet as I stumbled into the kitchen. I grabbed my keys off the counter, fumbling with them, desperate to get out of the house. I just needed to get to the door. Just leave. But as I reached for the front door, something stopped me cold. There was a knock. 3 soft, rhythmic knocks, as if someone was waiting just outside. My breath caught in my throat, and I stood frozen in place, the keys clutched tightly in my hand. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. But something was wrong. The knock didn't sound like it was coming from the front door. It was coming from upstairs. I slowly turned, my body rigid with fear. The sound had come from above, from Ethan's room, from the very place where I had left the bear. The pressure in the house grew unbearable, like the walls themselves were breathing, like the air had thickened into something tangible, something alive. Then, the faintest sound reached my ears, a soft creaking, like wood bending under weight. My heart slammed against my ribs as I realized what it was. The bear was moving. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the top of the stairs, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It was just a toy, just a stupid old toy. But the dread building inside me, the suffocating weight of it all, told me otherwise. I needed to see. I needed to know. Against every instinct, I moved back toward the stairs, each step slower than the last, my legs heavy and trembling. The house was too quiet now, the air thick with anticipation. I reached the bottom of the staircase and looked up. The bear was halfway down the stairs, sitting on one of the steps, its head tilted to the side, as if it was looking at me, daring me to come closer. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was impossible. It couldn't have moved on its own. But here it was, getting closer, the pressure in the air growing thicker with every passing second. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the bear. It sat there perfectly still, but I could feel it sense it watching me, drawing me in. And then I saw something I hadn't noticed before. The bear's fur, it was stained. A dark, reddish stain matted the fur around its paws, like it had been dragged through dirt. Or something worse. My stomach churned, and I took a shaky step backward, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. And then I remembered the photograph, the one from Ethan's room, the one where Ethan had been holding the bear. But it wasn't the happy memory I had thought it was. No, his smile had been wrong. His eyes had been filled with terror, and now I understood why. The bear had been with him, watching him, controlling him. Even back then, I dropped the keys. There was no time for logic, no time to make sense of it. I bolted for the back door, my only thought being to escape, to get out of this house and away from whatever was happening. As I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking uncontrollably, I heard the soft, unmistakable sound of the bear's paws dragging across the floor behind me. Closer, closer. I yanked the door open, stepping out into the cool night air, my heart racing as I slammed the door shut behind me. The silence outside was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the thick, suffocating atmosphere of the house. I backed away, breathing heavily, staring at the darkened windows, half expecting to see the bear's face peering out at me. But nothing moved. The house stood silent, still, as if nothing had happened at all. I didn't look back as I ran down the driveway, my feet pounding against the pavement. I didn't stop until I was well beyond the reach of that house, its dark presence lingering in the back of my mind, a shadow that would never quite fade. As I fled, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped, that the bear would follow. Hey there, don't forget to like the video and subscribe.